Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I'm joined today by the Washington Post's Craig Whitlock. He has a great new book out. It's called Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. You may have heard of Craig's work before. A few years back, he wrote a book called The Pentagon Papers, which was an excellent recounting of 20 years of failure and corruption during the U.S. war in Afghanistan. You all know the Realignment spends a more than decent amount of time covering the U.S. military, the Pentagon, and America's foreign policy and national security objectives. Obviously, a lot of those stories and interviews we tell are very positive. They're focused on the mission and what we can do to actually preserve America's global presence and our overall national security. All that said, though, I think it's really important that we examine the underside of that story, that we look at corruption, incompetence, and bad behavior so that moving forward, the listeners and viewers of this show can know how we can do better and prevent these things from happening. So the Fat Leonard scandal is one of the biggest scandals in the history of the U.S. military. Lots of fascinating stuff, really interesting story. Really recommend the book. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Craig Whitlock, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited to chat with you, Craig, as I mentioned before the recording. So listeners are either going to know you from your reporting at the Washington Post, or they, like me, will come about your work through your recent book, The Pentagon Papers. We're here to talk about your latest book, though. It's called Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Blinked, and Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. Quick question to start us off. Do you think there's a tie, narratively speaking, between the Afghanistan Papers book you wrote and this book, as listeners are coming into this?
Not directly, but I think there are some common themes. You know, in the Afghanistan Papers, what I was able to document was that over 20 years of war, that the military commanders in charge of that war in Afghanistan, didn't level with the American people about how things were going. They'd say one thing in public, put a gloss on things, and then in private or in documents or emails contemporaneously, they would bemoan how bad things were going, how they didn't have a strategy, how their whole approach didn't make any sense. So there's this complete paradox between their public statements and private statements. With Fat Leonard, it's a different book, different theater. For the most part, there is one chapter about Afghanistan, but in the U.S. Navy, which wasn't as prominent, of course, in Afghanistan, but you still have this problem of commanders, commanding officers, admirals saying one thing in public and acting one way when they know the camera is on, and acting an entirely different way when the public doesn't see what they're up to. So most of the people in this book were senior military officers, senior Navy officers who gladly took bribes or gifts or favors from a defense contractor named Leonard Francis. They did that behind closed doors. In public, though, these were really the best and brightest the Navy had to offer. It was striking the number of admirals, commanding officers of aircraft carrier strike groups, chiefs of naval operations, director of naval intelligence, superintendent of the Naval Academy. This was the royalty of the Navy, so to speak, and they all got in thick with Fat Leonard. And again, completely opposite of their public reputations. For these were people who were well regarded for their intellectual rigor, but also for their integrity. And that's the irony of all this, is that when the door was closed or when the lights were off, their integrity went out the window.
I think that's the most shocking at a personal level experience I had reading this book, because, and this isn't a defense of the generals in question when it came to Afghanistan and the Pentagon Papers, but at a core level, I think generals and theater commanders in Afghanistan specifically faced a situation where politicians themselves didn't want to quite leave Afghanistan in a bunch of different cases. They were given this sort of vague mission. There's a world where if President Trump or if President Biden were never elected, we just stayed in Afghanistan doing the same thing for another 40 or 50 years, because end of the day, like, that's a civilian-led military where there's this amorphous set of objectives and expectations, et cetera. But in this case, in this story, This is just literally individuals on their own responding to illegal, immoral, improper acts. And I think that in of itself is just much more depressing to me, because I understand you're a theater commander and you're told to come up with a surge plan that you don't think could actually work, but you're still ordered to do so. That is entirely different than taking pictures of prostitutes and getting paid, six-figure dinners and different events like that.
That's exactly right. And, the Navy leadership can't blame their civilian overseers, the civilian officials in charge of the Department of the Navy for what happened in the Fat Leonard case. This was people in uniform for the vast majority. There were some Navy civilians and personnel commands who were taking bribes from Leonard Francis to fix contracts. But the leadership in this was all uniform military. And it's striking the degree to which Leonard Francis cultivated senior officers. He would in effect groom them. I know that's kind of a loaded word, but that was one he would use, that over time he would build these relationships with people he could tell were going to rise through the ranks and be influential. He cultivated these relationships. And then when they made flag, when they became admirals, these were seen as his allies. Leonard Francis knew that in the military, rank means everything, and that if the rest of the fleet, if enlisted sailors saw him palling around with admirals or commanding officers of warships, that nobody would question what he was up to, that they knew he was somebody who was untouchable. And for the most part, he was. He recognized the importance of rank, and it was striking the degree to which how many senior officers really turned a blind eye to what Leonard was doing or jumped in the pool with him to accept his gifts and dinners and prostitutes. And again, this is completely at odds with the public reputation of the Navy. And there were, it goes without saying, there's a lot of people in this book who are graduates of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, which of course is, like the other service academies, a very famous and very strict honor code, honor concept, that if you're in the Naval Academy, you get caught cheating on a test or telling a fib, they'll kick you out. Yet when these people went into the fleet, the Seventh Fleet out in Asia, their character, their integrity was completely opposite of what they had been trained and imbued with when they were coming up through the Naval Academy. And again, it's this paradox between the public perception of the Navy's leadership and what was happening when nobody was watching, or at least none of the public.
So when you do an interview about a book like this, I don't want to just sort of say, then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? So to kind of take a quick step back, I notice in the on the jacket when there's offering the summary of the book, this refers to the Fat Leonard scandal as one of the largest corruption scandals in U.S. military history. One of the largest. So is there a scandal bigger than just this? Maybe not as salacious, maybe not as movie worthy, but is there a scandal bigger than this that we can kind of level set with?
There are other corruption scandals in terms of the dollar value of contracts that were defrauded or bigger. But this is the most extensive in terms of personnel involved. So Leonard Francis, just to give a little background, was a Malaysian defense contractor. His company, Glen Defense Marine Asia, was based in Singapore, and he was what the Navy calls a husbanding contractor, meaning that's Navy lingo for a company that provides services whenever a ship pulls into port. And the U.S. Navy, of course, its biggest forward deployed fleet is in Asia, and that's where Leonard Francis was based. And his company, over time, obtained all of the Navy contracts to service and refuel and provide ships with water, food, tugboats, whatever they needed when they pulled into a foreign port in Asia. He built this over 25 years. By the time of his arrest in 2013 in a sting operation, he held Navy contracts worth more than $200 million. So, he was a pretty big fish in Asia. But the most extensive part of this scandal is the number of people who were investigated. From 2013 to the present, NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and the Justice Department had more than 1,000 people under investigation. Now, many of them had gone to dinners with Leonard Francis or taken small gifts, and a number of them were exonerated or cleared. But just the fact that they had 1,000 individuals on their investigative list is there's really no other case like that I could come across in modern history, the number of people swept up in it. The other thing, there were more than 90 admirals retired in active duty who were investigated or questioned in this case. And again, there's no other scandal, no other case that's involved that many senior general or flag officers. It really is in a case of its own.
No, and that's such a good way to put it, because on the one hand, we could measure scandal by the sheer dollar amount of the individual contract. I mean, some of the instances that you catalog in the book are, okay, he is tasked with removing wastewater from an aircraft carrier. And I think the number in one example was overbilled by $68,000. So in, the very specific literal example there, that doesn't seem like that much of a big deal. When you scale that type of act across 25 years, that's really when, we should be judging this in different senses. So here's where I'd like to start then, now that we've gotten a little specific. It seems to me that personalities like Leonard's are able to really identify weak points in systems and then attack them. Looking at the post-Cold War 1990s War on Terror Navy, there's like an interesting side plot, not even side plot, but like Yemen and the USS Cole bombing. It's actually pretty important to the story here. So the 1990s to 2000s, what weakness do you see that he picked up on within the U.S. military and the Navy specifically that made it so susceptible to his scheme?
Yeah, that's right, Marshall. So there is this turning point in 2000 when the USS Cole was bombed in Yemen by Al-Qaeda. They, for people who weren't around back then or don't remember, they loaded up a motorboat with explosives and had suicide bombers blow it up next to this U.S. guided missile destroyer in Aden in Yemen, and nearly sank the ship, killed a number of U.S. sailors, and this completely upended the Navy's calculus for force protection in foreign ports. It wasn't just that they had to worry about hostile powers coming after them. For the most part, they could outgun anybody else. But here you had an asymmetric warfare from a terrorist group. And this was right before 9/11. So there wasn't this widespread knowledge of Al-Qaeda. But suddenly the U.S. Navy had to figure out, how are we going to protect our ships in foreign ports, particularly civilian ports? And in this case, Leonard Francis, rather, maybe not weakness is the right word, but he certainly spied an opportunity that he knew. He had a number of contracts in Asia at that point, places like Indonesia and Malaysia and sometimes in Singapore, to provide port services and force protection for U.S. Navy ships. But he knew that if he was going to keep these contracts, he was going to have to guarantee that he could protect the ships and their crews when they were in port. So he invented something that he called the Ring of Steel. And that sounds great, right? But really it was this brilliant stroke of marketing on his point, that he really just had a bunch of barges that were hooked up with these steel cables that he could surround a ship at the pier or in port to prevent these, a motorboat like Al-Qaeda used in Yemen to attack the ship. And nobody quite knew if it would work. It had never been tested, but it sounded great, right? Ring of Steel. Who can defeat that? And the other moment of inspiration for Leonard is he realized he could charge pretty much whatever he wanted to use the Ring of Steel. This wasn't pre-baked into Navy contracts. It was an extra added item. And he realized that Navy ship captains were willing to pay whatever it would take to add some measure of protection, protect them and their crews. And so he would charge millions of dollars sometimes just to use this for a several-day port visit for an aircraft carrier strike group. And it immediately became a cash cow for him for a number of years and really enabled his company to move into other ports in Thailand, Hong Kong, the Philippines, places where his competitors didn't offer this level of force protection. So yes, it was a weakness, but it was also an opportunity for Leonard, and he jumped on it.
Here's the weakness I'm thinking about, and you tell this really great in the story. So to your point, and you point this out, it was never truly field tested. But if you actually think about what happened to the captain or the commander, I don't know the actual rank of the commanding officer of the USS Cole, they were drummed out of the Navy from a pure responsibility perspective. So you had a dynamic where the question wasn't, okay, is the Ring of Steel truly going to prevent asymmetric attackers from coming after our ship? The question is, does this cover my ass? Does this make it seem like I'm doing my job? Does it make it seem like I did what was necessary? And maybe he wasn't thinking about at that level of granularity. It's just so fascinating to understand at a human psychology level. That is a dynamic that was kind of going in, versus an environment where people were simply saying, no. Like, we have to make sure this works, and that will determine whether or not we're going to go through that. So that was just kind of an interesting example of how the psychology kind of works there.
Well, and that's right. And it is important to stress that the Navy has long had this tradition of commanding officers, particularly of ships and submarines, are held accountable for everything that happens on their watch. So even, the ship runs aground, even if it's the fault of a low-ranking enlisted sailor, the commanding officer is held accountable because it's their job to train that sailor, or to make sure they're trained to make sure things are done right. And this was a legacy of the Cole attack, was that the commanding officer of the Cole, named Kirk Lippold, he was a Navy commander at the time. Over time, he was forced to retire from the Navy. Congress even wanted to hold someone accountable for that attack, even though there were all these after-action investigations done that found that the commander was not at fault. There was really nothing he could have done in advance. There was no intelligence about al-Qaeda doing this sort of thing. He hadn't violated any procedures or policies or guidelines, yet there was this enormous pressure to hold someone in charge accountable. And so for years after that, and up to the present day, Navy captains, commanding officers of ships know that they're accountable for what happens to their ship and their crew in port. So you're right. Who wants to take the risk of not using something like the Ring of Steel, right? That means they're putting their careers on the line in addition to the welfare of their crews and the ship. So Leonard picked up on this. He was very smart, and he knew that nobody was who would want to gamble with that. Of course, they were all going to spend the extra several $100,000 to rent the Ring of Steel for a few days. The other thing he realized, this was a weakness in the Navy systems, was that the ship captains didn't have to pay for it. It was the Pacific Fleet headquarters back in Hawaii that had to foot the bill. And as long as the ship captain said it was necessary, or the 7th Fleet commander said it was necessary, then they would have to pay for it. So again, Leonard was very perceptive on not just the psychology of people in charge of the Navy, but also the bureaucracy of how things were paid for. And, again, this was a cash cow for him. He made millions and millions of dollars off just moving these barges with steel cables around from port to port.
So help me understand something which I think most people, when they're reading the book, will struggle to understand. So he wasn't just upcharging on mediocre barge defenses or overcharging when it came to wastewater removal. He was bribing. You have the prostitutes, and you have the dinners, you have large gifts, you have small gifts, you have medium gifts. He basically hits every single thing you could possibly imagine. And he famously would start targeting. He's in many ways, you point this out, he's operating just purely, he's operating as an intelligence operative would, just for his own purely capitalistic gain himself. But he would ask people questions like, what are your vices? Just very directly ask that question, which then inevitably led, if you're, thinking about 40 and 50 something men, it's unshocking that the vices would lean towards prostitution, cash gifts, vacations, etc. Most people are going to read those sentences and just say to themselves, look, in my own life, if I met this person who people already say is sketchy, that's the key thing. He had a sketchy he delivered the jobs, but people would say he had a bad reputation. If someone walked up to you at the Washington Post and said, Craig, what's your vice? You would just, I feel as if you would just, low stakes, high stakes, just be off put by that. Why did this work in the Navy of the 2000s?
Leonard Francis was one of the world's greatest con men. He was very charismatic. He was he knew how to study human nature. He would brag that every sailor has a weakness. That was a quote of his. And he would figure it out. And he wasn't very subtle about it, but he would gather intelligence on people. He had moles or informants throughout the 7th Fleet in Asia, embedded throughout their bureaucracy, and he'd collect intelligence on people. He knew that, there was a new commanding officer coming to Singapore or Japan or an aircraft carrier, he would study them and he would find out, are they having marital problems? Do they like to drink? Do they like cigars? And do they have money problems? And he would find out, any chink in the armor. But again, the thing with Leonard was he would start small. He would see, he'd host a reception and see who'd be willing to, take a cigar, and not just any cigar. He'd offer Cohiba cigars from Cuba. And you have to remember that federal ethics rules are that you can't accept gifts of more than $20 at a time from a federal contractor. And everybody in the Navy knew this. But Leonard would, he'd offer a dinner that maybe would be $100 a person. But again, he'd see who would go for it. And then he'd up the ante a little bit the next time. If he saw somebody took a Cuban cigar, the next time he'd give them a humidor full of a bunch of cigars the next time they were in port. Or, there was one officer told me the story about how he was talking with Leonard at a reception aboard the deck of a warship, and he admired Leonard's cigar lighter. And, sure thing, next day, Leonard had sent a gift basket to the ship for this officer with one of his fancy cigar lighters, a bunch of cigars, the business card for his tailor to make him a bespoke suit. He's just slowly escalating to see who takes it. And then it's just another step beyond that to see who will take cash, who will take vacations. He would subsidize officers staying at fancy hotels in Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, places like that. And he would just essentially, who's willing to take the freebie? And then over time, it would get bigger and bigger. But by that point, he's got you, right? You can't go back. Then he can ask for favors in return. And he knows he has them over a barrel at that point because they violated regulations. If word got out of what gifts or prostitutes or anything else they had taken, there really wasn't anything they could do to extricate themselves. So Leonard, over time, he was brilliant about this, how he methodically reeled people in. And you're right, people in hindsight, how could you fall for this stuff, right? But the truth is, with Leonard, he got dozens and dozens and dozens of people to fall for it year after year. And, he was a master at this.
And it's wild because there's even, and to your point, it's not just that he would, rhetorically have these stories over people. He would purposely take photographic incidents. There's a funny example of the book of where it's a Navy captain, I believe. Leonard's passing around a photograph for everyone to sign, and the Navy captain goes, "I knew I shouldn't have signed it, and it would come bite me in the ass, but I did it anyways." That just goes to, I think, the real psychological skill he had of understanding when the humidor is getting passed around and there are prostitutes, and you just don't want to be a buzzkill. Like that's another funny human psychological thing. It seems to me that the human desire to not be a buzzkill is unmatched at a core level, from the JAGs to the chaplains to basically anyone you would think would say no go. They just clearly didn't want to say no go.
Yeah, and there's two factors at play in that regard, I think, Marshall. One is the Navy had this long tradition of when you're on deployment to the Western Pacific, what they call Westpac, that this was sort of like Las Vegas for them. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You're far from home, you're away from your family, you're thousands of miles from the United States. You could get away with behaviors there that you'd never think of doing back at home. So there was this tradition that predated Leonard Francis of people going crazy in ports in Asia. I mean, you think of going back to Vietnam and World War II about legalized prostitution in the Philippines and Thailand, Korea, other places where Navy ships would often visit. And Leonard, so he was able to build on that, this sense that people would do things in Western Pacific that they never do in the United States. But the other thing, again, getting back to this point on rank, Leonard knew that if he could get the commanding officer or an admiral or the senior officer in charge to go to one of his dinners, to go to one of his parties with women around, to accept the cigar, that everybody else would take their cue from that. The boss says it's okay, whether by implication or not. Who am I to question the boss that this must be permissible? And when I obtained a lot of documentation from federal investigators who looked into this case for 10 years. And you would see this time and again when the Navy would consider discipline for officers or sailors who took gifts or dinners from Leonard Francis, it would always come back to, well, they were there, it was a group dinner, the commanding officer was there, the JAG said it was okay. So people were let off the hook in terms of responsibility, because it was this idea that you're following the lead of the commanding officer, the senior officer, and you shouldn't be held accountable for it. And this is still a problem, I think, in the Navy to this day, is as long as you're taking your cues from the boss, people can kind of set aside their ethical standards, their own integrity, and they just kind of go along with it. But again, this was Leonard's genius. He knew that if the top officer, the senior ranking officer, was seen as being friends with him, was seen as making a statement that this behavior was acceptable, that everybody else would go along with it, or at least they wouldn't blow the whistle, which was just as important. So again, it happened time after time after time. He'd throw these outrageous parties with prostitutes, with meals, with you name it, and he would never get in trouble for it because everybody took their cues from the top.
And it's kind of funny, you referred to Francis as a con artist, but I actually would kind of push back on that characterization of him, because I think it understates how dangerous he is, because he delivered. Like think about a tech founder, right? Like the dunk on Elizabeth Holmes is that with Theranos, she couldn't actually deliver. She couldn't actually deliver the product she was promising for folks. And this goes across all these different examples in entrepreneurial history. But he did drain the wastewater. He did actually arrange. There are actually numerous examples of the book of him being assigned. He's a gambler, right? He takes on these jobs that are pretty tough jobs, and he arguably shouldn't be able to pull the jobs, and he pulls them off. So he's able to combine enough competence that, like, yeah, he's sketchy, but he does get things done. He couldn't have been that sketchy and just a pure con artist who can't deliver. It's the fact that he could combine the sketchiness and the fun that was attached to that with, no, but look, he will deliver you your ring of steel. And look, you know this, like, there wasn't another attack like the USS Cole. So technically speaking, and you also point this out too, like there's the implication that he would actually spread rumors about foiled attacks, all those different dynamics. But I just think it's important that people understand that, like, the thing that's more dangerous than a con artist is a con artist with the personality who also knows to deliver 85% of what the customer is looking for. Because then you could just keep on going forever.
No, that's right. And you're right. He had this reputation for being able to deliver, and the quality of the husbanding services he provided was generally pretty good. I mean, sometimes they fell down on the job, but compared to his competitors, he certainly could deliver. And I'll give you one story of this. In 2007, the Bush administration's trying to strike a nuclear cooperation deal with the government of India, which is a big strategic deal. You know, after years of being distant from India because of their nuclear testing, that the Bush administration was essentially going to work together and come to an understanding. So the White House and the Pentagon wanted to send a carrier strike group very quickly to India. They were going to send it to Chennai. But the problem was the U.S. Navy didn't have any husbanding contractors in India, didn't regularly send ships there, had never sent a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to India. And so in a few weeks' notice, they hired Leonard Francis and his company to essentially moved this fleet of barges and cranes and tugboats all the way from Singapore to the coast of India. They actually went through a cyclone, and some of these barges almost sank. So Leonard really did put his neck out on the line for the U.S. Navy, and he delivered, and the port visit worked out. Now, the flip side, the con side, is he then charged the Navy more than he had ever charged for a single port visit. It was several $1 million for a few days' work. And he was able to do this because there was no pre-existing contract, and really he knew he had the Navy over a barrel. Then he would take it a step further. When the carrier strike group, this was the USS Nimitz, went to its two next ports, were in Singapore and Hong Kong, he made sure that he hosted these excessive $20,000 dinners for the commanding officer and the wardroom. And he also subsidized the hotel rooms that he put up the senior officers in during shore leave. So, you know, he's making the most of it. He's milking it for all it's worth. And that's how he made his money. But you're right. He could deliver. It wasn't like Elizabeth Holmes where he made up a product out of thin air. It's just he was a genius at finding new ways to gouge the federal government to pay for any sort of service, whether it was removing sewage, tugboats, you name it. He would always pile on the charges. But again, he realized that the Navy really, frankly, didn't care that much about how much it had to pay as long as it could accomplish the mission. So he always made sure the Navy could carry out the mission. Then he could charge whatever he wanted, even though this was in violation of all these contracting standards.
I'm curious, was there ever an example in your reporting and recounting of the story where all of these practices endangered either U.S. Navy lives or the actual mission? Because there's this funny example of you talk about this debaucherous. You do such a great job with this. Like, I also love this. Like, a lot of people do audiobooks, and I'm happy I read the book, because when you go through the menu of these dinners, you have it in like fancy letterhead and duck confit with like this or that. So you describe this decadent dinner of all the prostitutes, and you say, and then the strike group, sailed and then launched 3,000 strikes to support U.S. warfighters on the ground in Iraq. AKA, like, this whole time, like, it doesn't seem like anything's amiss and they're actually doing their job well. So on the one hand, you could say, like, not great, but we're doing our jobs. Like, did that ever cross into the other end of things?
Absolutely. And here's the thing that to people of this day, I don't think quite comprehend the national security threat Leonard posed. And he did this because it wasn't just gouging the Navy, overcharging them, padding bills. Leonard Francis was a master of espionage. He got 10 U.S. Navy officers and one Royal Australian Navy officer who was a liaison to the U.S. Navy. So he got 11 officers to leak him military secrets over a 7-year period. What these secrets were was classified information about U.S. ship schedules throughout the Asia Pacific. And so he would get these schedules. He would say, this carrier strike group is supposed to visit this port in 6 months. Then they're going to go here and go there. And the Navy has always protected ship schedules. They've guarded them very, very closely because, you don't want to subject your crews or ships to hostile forces. You don't want the enemy to know where they might go next. This goes back to World War II when people think of loose lips sink ships. Even the families of sailors aren't allowed to know where they're going next. They only find out maybe a few days before a port visit, never months and months in advance. And Leonard Francis, as a Malaysian national, was not supposed to have this information. Yet he convinced 10 U.S. Navy officers and one Australian officer to leak him a steady drip-by-drip schedule of all these U.S. ships, scores of them in Asia for years. And he could have easily sold this to China, to Russia, to North Korea, any other hostile power. There's no evidence he did, but at the same time, this was something that NCIS and the Justice Department were in a panic about when they first started investigating Leonard Francis and realized that he had bribed people for classified information. They want to know, what's he doing with this? Is he protecting it? And that was his systems, his own computer systems were vulnerable to hacking. His IT manager was friendly with the Chinese officials at the embassy in Singapore. So we don't know what happened to that information, but it wasn't protected. But again, to have one guy, a foreigner, bribe 10 different U.S. Navy officers to leak the military secrets, that still makes my head explode. It'd be a scandal if he got one person to do it. But to get 10, there's no other comparable case like that in modern history.
I think something that also plays into this dynamic is I was thinking about this in terms of you describing the trips and the prostitutes and the cash gifts. Can you think of a profession where the gap between how hard charging and accomplished you need to be to get as far as you've gotten? So we're talking ensign all the way to admiral. The personality, the hard chargingness, all those features to how much you're actually paid, which isn't that much, must be, I can't think of another industry where the gap is that big. That's not attacking other parts of the government bureaucracy, but there's just something I think just so like specifically like macho and aggressive, about like rising the ranks of the military. I think that's pretty unique, where it seems like at a core level, part of the psychology of these admirals, and I actually think I do a lot of work in the defense tech space. So I'm always thinking about this, where like you meet these 4 stars or these 3 stars and you're with some VCs, and like the VCs are worth so much more money. And yes, it's true that the VCs need something from the admirals. They need a program approved. They need a company invested in, et cetera. But just at a baseline level, like, you know, the 4 stars driving home to their like moderate, like modest suburban home, in contrast to what a master of the universe is, you know, like kind of like really living with. So talk about how like their just like class status had to have played some part of this.
I think it's not just class status, but I think what Leonard exploited was a sense of entitlement, particularly among senior officers, that had really taken root, I think, particularly after 9/11. You know, during the first 10 or 15 years after 9/11, when the war in Afghanistan and Iraq is going on, you know, the public in the United States really put the military on a pedestal, and understandably so, that, you know, these were people who are defending our country. But I think after a while you get told, thank you for your service enough that, you know, there is that danger, that risk that you feel entitled. And Leonard certainly knew how to throw gasoline on that spark of flame. So whenever you would have a ship come into port in Singapore, Hong Kong, you name it, you know, the contract was that Leonard's company was supposed to provide a car and driver for the commanding officer and some other senior officers on the ship. But, you know, in the contract could have been a Toyota or something, right? But Leonard would make sure it was a Mercedes or a Jaguar, and he would make sure that the admiral or the captain was put up in the 5-star hotel with the extra suites that cost a lot more money, and he would have flowers there in the room, and, you know, and maybe he would have some girls knock on the door, and he would host a celebratory dinner. And it wasn't just any dinner. Again, the limit here is supposed to be $20 a person, but Leonard would host dinners that would cost up to $1,000 a head. And he would use this primarily with alcohol, with Cristal, champagne, Dom Perignon. And you mentioned these menus I got in the book. Those are the actual menus from these dinners. Leonard would keep these commemorative 7-course menus with lobster thermidor and, you know, and food to this day I've never set eyes on before. And he knew that he was trying to give them that case of what you were talking about with the VC crowd, the tech people who have that high life. He knew that people in the Navy weren't able to have that in their daily existence. They had been at sea for weeks, you know, eating food on the ship. So he's showing them the Las Vegas style of living that he could afford because he was gouging the Navy. But he knew if he gave them a taste of the high life, a lot of people would go for that, and they would let down their guard and they would accept it. And he's right. That's what it did. I had this one interview with a Navy captain who was on the USS Nimitz, and he to this day didn't have a problem with this kind of treatment. He said, you know, I've been fighting wars. We've been at sea for months on end. If I come into port and a rich foreigner who's patriotic and wants to take us out to a fancy dinner, what's the problem with that, right? You know, but again, I think these people didn't see that he was reeling them in because he would always demand something in return at some point. And that's the danger that they fell into that trap.
Wait, that's a fascinating interview. Help me understand this, because and you could answer this part of the question too, like, his relationship to America is like interesting. So like he loves Elvis. He goes to Graceland. He visits a friend in Nashville during that trip and like goes to like a kitschy ex-urban store and buys all this like America kitsch to decorate his office with. He's giving people all these like America themed gifts. So like I get where that Navy captain is starting with, hey, like if a patriot wants to support the troops, then what's the big deal? It seems like this becomes a big deal beyond just the abstract when he asks things of people, when he engages in counterintelligence. And also, it seems like this Navy captain has to understand that at a baseline level, we got lucky that he really was just a greedy dude and not an asset of the Russians or the Chinese that we know of. Of course, you make reference to the fact that some of the prostitutes had Russian accents. So how much do we actually know from a pure, how this plays out perspective? Like, did the captain really not understand this? Like, that seems like the real indictment.
I think they let down their guard. And this is part of Leonard's charm, but also his genius was they underestimated him. they didn't see him as a foreign agent. They saw him as Fat Leonard, this big, jolly, fat guy who
500 pounds at one point, as you know. We should be clear about that part of the title.
Right. But I mean, I think that his physique was part of it. They didn't see him as a threat, right? He was this guy, big smile on his face, loved to tell jokes. He sounded and looked like an American. He had Lee Greenwood on his cell phone ringtone, God bless the USA. He'd wear neckties with the American flag. His name, Leonard Francis, is very Anglo, even though he was a Malaysian citizen. In his early years, he would tell visiting Navy officers that he had gone to university at UNC in Chapel Hill and that he was friends with Michael Jordan, right? He'd just tell these stories and make it up, but people would believe him. He was very persuasive. So they didn't see him as a foreign threat. They saw him as good time Leonard, who was there to show his thanks and appreciation for everything they do. They saw him as a patriotic guy. So you're right. In retrospect, you think, how could these people fall for this? But he was very clever at what he did. And it was all part of his persona that he would get people to let down their guard until it was too late. I mean, there were a number of officers who had been giving him classified material, and they were getting ready to transfer to a new position back in the States, or they would try and wiggle out of it at some point. They'd realize they'd gotten in too deep and that they were in real trouble potentially. But Leonard he'd send orders to them. He'd say, no, I demand that I expect that you're going to send me those ship schedules by next week. I need those. And he didn't have to threaten them beyond that because they knew he had them over a barrel at that point. One of the things I still this day can't get my head around is how many of these Navy officers who are his informants or moles or took bribes from him, they referred to him as boss, right? And there was no irony in this. They would send him emails or texts and say, boss, I got this for you, or boss, I did this just as you asked. I mean, there was no question that here were uniformed U.S. Navy officers. They thought he was the chain of command. They thought he was the commanding officer. He was the one who they were jumping and clicking their heels whenever he barked out an order. So to me, again, how did this guy, this 500-pound Malaysian guy was essentially the boss for so many U.S. Navy officers? It's still, to this day, it's hard for me to comprehend how that happened, but the contemporaneous evidence is clear on this. Leonard was the boss for a number of these people, and they carried out his every whim and command.
Here's what I don't quite understand, and I think folks will kind of be confused about. Why, and this is, obviously discoursed towards the end of the book, so don't give too many spoilers if you don't want to, but why would he do this? In the sense that, like, when you're going through some of the acts he did, overcharging $68,000, that's on an incredibly expensive tab for the Navy already. Why couldn't he just build? It seems like from a pure business building perspective, you would have a pretty rich enough life becoming the person who services the U.S. Navy without having to pad and develop these networks and engage in illegality. But was it just that the only way to get to that position of stability was the illegal acts? And did he kind of have like a cold start problem? Why would he do this when he clearly was as hardworking and ambitious as he was?
Great question. And that's the thing. If Leonard had scaled back the criminal behavior and the fraud a little bit, he probably could have gotten away with this in perpetuity, right? Mm-hmm. That he was providing a service. It was just he was over the top with everything, and he kept going deeper and deeper and farther with the overbilling and the fraud and the parties and you name it. But it really does come down to two things: greed and ambition. Leonard had this huge ego, still has this huge ego. He loves the idea that he's being talked about all the time in the United States, that he's the guy.
You've helped him out with this. You've given him a book.
He loves this. He loves media coverage. If there's no coverage of his case, he gets depressed. He loves the idea that people know that he pulled one over on the best and brightest in the U.S. Navy. So he's this huge ego. So he wanted to do more and more, get more contracts. He had to be more brazen about it. And after a point, it becomes a self-fulfilling cycle, right? You have to keep bribing people more to keep the business model going. But the irony was he got away with this for 25 years till he was caught. And so he had no real reason to suspect that he would ever be brought down. He had enough moles and informants embedded throughout the Navy that they would always tip him off if there was an NCIS investigation. It was one of the remarkable findings in my book is that NCIS had opened 26 criminal investigations into Leonard's company over some 12 years, and they closed all of them without taking action because Leonard was always able to get a step ahead. And it was only at the end that he finally got caught in a sting operation, that were investigating fraud in Thailand and Japan, that the house of cards came down. But it was almost a fluke in the end that they were able to catch him. He almost had got away with it up till the very end. So from his perspective, he had no real reason to think he would get caught. So why not push the envelope more and more? It had never hurt him before that.
What has this story taught you about the security clearance process? Because, I'm thinking about the 2010s. I'm in DC. I'm with all my, ambitious government kid friends. And we're all just sort of like spazzing out over like, oh no, like I smoked weed this one time in high school. Like, am I totally screwed? I have no future in government. And you're just saying this is a dude who has 26 different investigations launched against him. Whether or not those investigations close, I will say if I were dictator of the Pentagon, I would probably have a policy that once a certain number of questions are asked, by default, we're going to withdraw privileges. And maybe he didn't traditionally have a TSSCI in terms of this process, but this just seems like, once again, that's like a wild, how did that work?
Look, it just defies all common sense, Marshall. I mean, here's a guy in his early 20s in Malaysia. He was a convicted felon. That the Malaysian police arrested and charged him with gun crimes for being involved in armed robbery. And in Malaysia, gun crimes are a big deal. You can go to death row just for possessing an unregistered gun. And Leonard spent time in prison. And this was before he started working for the U.S. Navy. This was in the newspapers in Malaysia, this case. Yet, how does a guy like that, a young guy in his 20s with a felony record for gun crimes, a foreign national, how does he get contracts to serve the U.S. Navy? Right? And this is even before the NCIS investigations start, or the talk of fraud and bribery and all that. It was just from the get-go, the whole system just didn't screen him out for whatever reason. And he was able to just walk through these giant loopholes in the system. But you're right. I mean, they should have seen this. This guy should have raised red flags, 100 miles away. But he kept going and the system didn't catch him. I'll give you another example of just how brazen some of this was. One of Leonard's first times to get his hands on classified information, he had been cultivating these sources on the 7th Fleet staff. The 7th Fleet is the Navy's forward deployed fleet throughout Asia and the Pacific. And the headquarters ship, the flagship, is called the USS Blue Ridge. So Leonard had been targeting people on the Blue Ridge, staff officers, because he wanted these classified ship schedules. So one of the first times he got it, he had one of his moles, who's a chief warrant officer working for the admiral on the 7th Fleet staff. He had him meet him at the U.S. Naval Base in Yokosuka. And Leonard had a driver in a BMW escort him up to the front gate of the naval base. It's one of the biggest military bases overseas for the U.S. military. This chief warrant officer escorts him past security, takes him right onto the ship, and hands him a couple computer disks with classified material on it, and carries on with Leonard, and they're shaking hands, and Leonard marches right off the base back into his BMW with the classified material. So all this guy had to do is have somebody on the inside welcome him onto a secure part of a U.S. warship, hand him classified material, and he walks back out. I mean, is this how, if it's that easy to crack our system, it makes your head explode. But Leonard was able to pull that off time after time. And you're right. I mean, you talk about getting security clearances, but there were no defenses for something like that. They just melted away when it came to Leonard Francis.
Something I'm really curious about when you're looking at his background and his story, it seems like one of the lessons. Well, here's an assumption I think folks could probably make. Oh, like the Navy had learned lots of lessons. They never could have perceived that something like this could happen in the first place. But as you said, there were a variety of rules. The $20 gift limit, limits on relationships. They have JAG officers, Judge Advocate Generals, who would advise the Navy captains and commanders about whether or not these dinners were okay to go to in the first place. And he just would do a couple of smart and honestly pretty funny things. Because no one died, I think we can laugh about this, because it's so smart. It's like, hey, just have everyone pay me $50 and we'll just lie and say that was enough to recompensate. Because what, like, is the JAG officer then supposed to like go through, visit the site afterwards and say, wait a second, there's no way $50 could have possibly compensated. So it's just kind of brilliant. It's a kind of example of if you just power through systems. So like, I guess what I'm kind of saying is, how do you build, what has the Navy done since that example to improve upon this? Or is this as simple as you basically just shouldn't be going to dinners anymore at that point?
Well, they haven't done anything. The rules are still the same. It was just back then everybody brazenly ignored them. Like you said, he would set up this, so to speak, don't ask, don't tell setup where, don't ask me how much this dinner costs, just pay me $50, even though they all knew it cost, 10 times that amount. The difference was Leonard would keep the receipts. He would keep the bills, and he hung on to all this stuff for years after years after years. He kept them in storage in Malaysia. And so when he pleaded guilty in 2015, he handed over all this incriminating material to the Justice Department. So all these Navy officers who thought they'd never get caught for going to $1,000 dinner with Leonard Francis, all of a sudden there's the receipt showing how much it costs, who was on the guest list, the photographs of who attended. And as you point out before, there'd be a commemorative menu with all these officers scribbling, thank you, Leonard, what a great time, you're a friend of the Navy. They'd autograph the menus for Leonard. He kept all that stuff. And then when NCIS came knocking at their door at the Pentagon, these officers would assume that there was no way they could, how are they going to prove that I went to these dinners or how much it costs? They didn't realize Leonard had all this incriminating material, and that's what sunk them in a lot of cases, that it just never occurred to them that they were being stupid by making a paper trail that would come back to haunt them years later. So the rules haven't really changed, but hopefully they're observing them more. I'll give you another example. This is in the book. The USS Blue Ridge one year was going on its spring swing of tours of ports throughout Asia, and it was getting ready to go into Hong Kong, and rumor had gotten out that Leonard was going to hold one of his wild party dinner bashes for senior officers on the ship. And so the JAG, the top lawyer on the fleet, found out that he heard there was this rumor that Leonard was going to have one of his parties. So he sounded a blast email to all the officers in the 7th Fleet and said, watch out for Leonard Francis. Remember, the gift limit is $20 a head. You can go to jail if you break the law on this. If you accept a bribe, it's not worth it. Stay away from Leonard Francis. So what happens? Some of the recipients of the email surreptitiously forward it to Leonard. He knows that the JAG is aware of this, and they still have a wild dinner party, but they just agree to keep it amongst themselves. And the chief of staff for the 7th Fleet was the guest of honor, so they know the boss isn't going to get them in trouble, so they just go ahead with it. So again, the system, the rules were in place to prevent this. The JAG officer knew about it. He warned people, but they still went ahead. They couldn't help themselves. So then it's really stupidity, but it's also this, they want to ignore the rules that are in place to uphold their standards. They don't care. And Leonard was able to take advantage of that.
So last two questions. So number one, we'll go do one of these one at a time. What has your reporting and your telling of this story taught you about maybe the flaws of the way we approach a culture of honor, let's say in the U.S. military, right? Because obviously this is at such a, and here's the thing, I think at a baseline level, even with your perfect honor code at the Naval Academy or at West Point or the Air Force Academy, obviously you're going to have bad apples. That's human nature. But this is systemic, right? What do you think went wrong at a baseline level with the way that professional military education relates to proper behavior basically went?
Yeah, so this wasn't a matter of ethical training or professional military education. As the former Navy Secretary Ray Mabus said to me in an interview once, he said, look, if you don't know by the time you join the U.S. Navy that it's wrong to take a bribe, if your mother didn't teach you that, God help us. All these people know it's wrong to take a bribe, right? It's wrong to go to $1,000 dinner. Everybody knows that. It doesn't take any special level of training or integrity or going to the Naval Academy. That's just basic common sense. And yet,
thank you for that correction, by the way. Actually, that's a very good point. We civilians too could not take bribes.
Right. So why did the common sense fly out the window? Well, again, there is this disparity between the public image and what they would do in private. But again, Leonard knew he didn't need to convince everybody in the Navy that this was okay. He just needed to convince a few admirals and commanding officers that everybody else would follow the lead, so to speak. But they were also, and this is the biggest lesson, everybody was afraid to blow the whistle on the senior officers. There were some people in the Navy, contracting officers, junior officers, who tried to report Leonard for fraud. Leonard's moles would always stamp it out, or his senior officer buddies would always try and shut down an investigation or would speak up on his behalf. So there were some people who were trying to do the right thing and blow the whistle on Leonard, but it was his buddies at the top of the chain of command who would always squash it. And people were always afraid, yeah, I got invited to this dinner, but the admiral said it was okay. So who am I to am I going to report him for that or her? No, of course not. They're afraid to go up against the chain of command. So that's where things went out the window, that there were too many people at a senior level who knew this was going on and didn't care or didn't want to rock the boat, so to speak. That's why it went on for as long as it did.
So wrap up question here. I said this to you before the recording started, but what I appreciate so much about this book and your previous book, The Pentagon Papers, is that I think there's, especially in a low institutional trust environment, it's very easy to write stories that basically say, look, the system, it's corrupt. They let you down. Obviously, the military is going to be this big military industrial complex full of corruption and this or that. By contrast, I think your book, very at a reportorial level, engages with everything that went wrong here, why it was more, why it was bad. But I think you also clearly offer folks who I think in good faith don't want to be part of broken systems, actual tools for improving them. So I would just kind of ask you to close with this. Basically, what have these two books taught you about how people should think of corruption or immoral acts within the U.S. military, and what people who want to reform the way those acts go down should take away moving forward? Because I really just don't want to leave people stewing in depression over these amorphous big systems that are always going to not work and be bad, because I don't think that's true.
No, you're right. And that's a good question. And the thing is, there are some heroes in both of these books, people who tried to do the right thing and stood up for what they thought was right. And there was one Navy captain named Jim Moss who had known Leonard for years. He then became he was a supply officer. He then worked for the Pacific Fleet, and he knew what Leonard was doing was wrong. And he led an effort to try and constrict Leonard's ability to build the Navy for many years. And he had to fight very hard to make that happen and to make it tougher for Leonard to overbuild the Navy. But and Leonard would try and compromise him, and he would spread dirt on him. And Leonard would go to his admiral buddies to try and get investigations launched into Jim Moss and get him fired from the Pacific Fleet. So it would have been easy for him to say, look, this isn't worth it. I don't need the hassle. I've got the powers that be in the Navy against me. But he kept going. There were also a couple JAG officers, including one Navy captain named Steve Barney. He was the guy I talked about sending out the warning message, warning people, don't do this, don't fall for this guy. So there were some people who, against the odds or against peer pressure, tried to stand up for what is right. And frankly, they'll go down in history as the people who did the right thing, who had the honor and integrity to maintain, even in this pressure to act otherwise. They'll go down in history in a good way. And there's a lot of people, unfortunately, who will go down in history as people who sold out their countries and sold out their integrity. So that's always the lesson, right? This could come back to haunt you at some point. So better to get it right in the beginning. And there are a few people who did, but unfortunately, the lesson in this case is for a lot of people in the Navy that you thought you could get away with it, but eventually the truth does come to light.
That is an excellent place to end the episode. Craig, this has been really great. The book is Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. It is out now. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Marshall. Really appreciate it. Great talking to you.